In the name of Allah, the most gracious, most merciful, we will start the next session, the second session, to be moderated by Dr. Sulaiman Ali Al-Greda, and with the participation of Their Excellencies Dr. Kiwi and Dr. Zuhair Abdul Jabbar, the Assistant Secretary General for the Evaluation and Development, and Dr. Khalid Al-Tamimi. And let's welcome everybody, and we wish you all the best. This session will be diversified regarding the evaluation of the educational programs and proposed standards for the evaluation for learning, and to give some background information. In the name of Allah, the most gracious, most merciful, I'm grateful to Allah the Almighty. May Allah's peace and blessings be upon the Prophet Muhammad. First, I would like to welcome you, everybody, in this session and in this annual event organized by the Ministry of Education in different fields. Undoubtedly, the theme that we focus on in this session or this occasion is one of the main factors, and it's the main criteria for evaluating the quality and the level of quality of what's available in the educational process and in all related areas. It is the evaluation. Time is limited, so let me introduce our guests in this session. We will have three presentations. First, from Dr. Bronwyn Kiwi and Dr. Zuhair Abdul Jabbar and Dr. Khalid Al-Tamimi. We will start with Dr. Kiwi regarding the evaluating of the educational programs, formative, summative, and accountability demands for assessment to support and not undermine learning. I will tell you a very brief history about our guest. She's working at Waikato University. She is an associate professor and director of the Welf Malcolm Institute of Educational Research. She was previously the director of the Center for Science and Technology Education Research. She has worked on a number of large national research projects, including the laptops for teachers evaluation, the evaluation of the environmental education in schools in Kora. She has a long history of experience in the researches on the situation of the teachers and students inside the classrooms, starting from grade 1 till grade 10, using interviews, observations, the collection of student work, and video as a data generation tools. She led a 3-year teaching and learning research initiative study on assessment for learning in science and technology primary classrooms, and a 2-year study on culturally responsive assessment and pedagogy in primary science classrooms. She has recently completed 2 curriculum exploratory studies projects, which were joint WMIER NZCR projects.
In New Zealand, on behalf of the organizing committee, Professor Kiwi, we would like to welcome you in this session. You have about 20 minutes to present your paper, and then we have 5 more minutes for general discussion. The microphone is yours, please.
Good morning. It's my pleasure to be here to talk to you about some classroom-based work in assessment in New Zealand. I'm going to begin my talk by outlining my theoretical orientation, introduce you to the New Zealand context, and then give some examples of practice. I think the previous speaker outlined clearly for us the multiple purposes and multiple layers of assessment that as it takes place in today's education systems. The three purposes which he discussed are relevant, I think, are well documented in the literature. Summative assessment, where we're looking at summing up learning. Formative assessment, where the aim is to enhance teaching and learning and has been a focus since the Paul Black and Dylan Willem review. And at the moment, increased interest in assessment for system accountability. I think we are at a point at time where we are thinking that each of these assessment purposes has a role and place to play in a productive assessment system, but that all assessment must enhance learning in some way. I think with this realisation of multiple purposes, we've become more aware of the needs and interests of the multiple users of assessment. So these range from students, teachers, schools, families, school communities, government agencies, NGOs. So we're no longer just looking at that interaction as being between individuals. But each of these different stakeholders does have different informational needs. New Zealand has just recently introduced a revised curriculum, and I think that our experience with this curriculum and earlier curricula reflects the international trend that acknowledges that curriculum and pedagogy form an interactive system. So when we change one, we necessarily need to change the other. Unfortunately, it seems that very often assessment lags behind curriculum innovation, and we struggle to reinvent our assessment processes in ways that reflect and give value to the curriculum goals we value. I take the earlier point, and I'd like to quote from Myron Aitken and Paul Black and their commentary on reform. What really counts in education is what happens when teachers and students meet. The wisdom of any decision about education is best judged on the basis of whether or not it raises the quality of these interactions. Thus, although I acknowledge assessment is a multi-layered system with multiple players, I ground my area of interest and focus of attention on the teacher and the student. What happens between these two in the classroom? If we turn to the New Zealand context...
Presentation is that? Are you using the presentation? Excuse me.
I'm sorry, I can't use the presentation because it's not the correct PowerPoint. It's a different PowerPoint.
Okay.
So in the New Zealand context, we have a national curriculum which runs from years 1 to years 13. It's got some very, the current goals include that the development of student capacity to become lifelong learners. The curriculum argues that it's no longer sufficient that students merely recall facts. They should be able to use and generate and critique knowledge. And there is a strong equity element through this curriculum that holds the expectation that all students can and will learn. So within this framework, very similar to that in Finland, it's teacher and school responsibilities to devise local curriculum, assessment and reporting regimes that build on from and draw from their student and community needs and interests. So I think I would claim that New Zealand has a high trust, high teacher responsibility curriculum framework. In terms of assessment, New Zealand has had a long tradition of a focus on formative assessment, that is, assessment that would enhance learning. That has been a focus for professional development since 1995. The system includes no national testing regimes that are comprehensive, although we have light sample monitoring of students at years 4 and 8. What's distinctive about this system, I feel, is that the students are assessed via a number of modes: individual work, group work, and written work. New Zealand teachers are assessors within this system, and they're actively involved in the grading. At the senior level, we have got a National Certificate of Educational Achievement, which again is standards-based, and teachers have some responsibility for assessing students against some standards. More recently, there has been the introduction of national standards for literacy and mathematics, and these do require national reporting. But I think the New Zealand assessment system can be summed up by saying that students are at the heart of the assessment. That when we look at the system, we want to build up from the classroom through teacher and student interactions that support students as active learners. And at the same time, there is a desire that at the top systems level, an environment will be created in which those productive and positive interactions can take place. So at this point, I'd like to move into the New Zealand primary science classroom and share with you some of the findings from work I've been doing with teachers and students over the past 10 years. And I'm in making this argument, I'm really stating that the classroom is the fundamental unit of analysis for gauging an assessment and education system health, and that student-teacher interactions are key within that. I've got 5 points that I wish to quickly make. One is around the role of curriculum planning. In New Zealand, in the primary sector, which is where I'm focusing my attention, there are no set textbooks, so teachers and schools do their own planning. In working with them, we have found that detailed planning is really important in order to develop the pedagogical content knowledge. That's the knowledge of the curriculum, the student, and where the student might go that teachers need in order to assess them effectively. It's also critical for teachers to clarify their expectations of student performance. What might the learning look like? It's important for them to clarify how they will make judgments about quality. How do we know what success looks like? It has also been important in our work in order that teachers can plan a meaningful, coherent learning journey for their students. Quite often, science can be taught as a series of disconnected and decontextualised facts. So as part of this process, we've looked at helping teachers tease out what are the big ideas and how are they connected. Then we've also focused on getting them to rehearse some of the activities, because there can be a tendency to equate science with hands-on activity, which really reduces to busy work, and the conceptual learning opportunities are lost. Some teachers' thoughts on planning. I'm just going to read a quote. Some things, concepts, need to be deliberately taught or brought to children's attention. You need to know what you want your children to know. Yes, it made me clarify exactly what were the ideas, so I was better able to help the children. The second point I want to make is about the challenge for teachers of balancing what I'm going to talk about is their accountability to the curriculum. We want our students to learn science, and their accountability to the ideas and experiences that the children bring to the learning. We know that children can find science boring and irrelevant. We only have to look at the statistics worldwide to see that this is a problem across countries. It's, in our view, starting with children young, building on the ideas they bring, is one way to address this. In our classrooms, teachers would use a combination of both planned and interactive formative assessment, where they deliberately set out to identify what students know and can do in relation to the curriculum, and they would also just interact with students while they were doing learning tasks to find out what they actually do know and are learning, and build on from that. A very skilled and complex activity. My third point about assessment within the classroom dynamic relates to the role of student self-assessment. How can we develop our children as lifelong learners? Finish? Oh, thank you. Good. I've now got the PowerPoint. I'll just quickly recap. This is just a quick insight into a typical New Zealand primary classroom. Lots of colour, lots of student work and plenty of interaction. Okay. So thinking about student self-assessment, this is challenging for all teachers, I think, because it involves giving up some of the power and control that they have become used to. But the literature on formative assessment and our own work has provided some evidence that teachers being specific about the criteria for quality is one way of moving, developing student self-assessment. If you look at the image on the right, you will see here two children working together with the criteria for quality through a process of peer assessment whereby they help each other enhance their learning. And on the left, we've also found that teachers can help support student self-assessment by doing what we've called seeding the environment with resources they can freely access. So here this child has tried to make a kite and it hasn't flown. So she has gone to the resource site in the classroom and is looking at a commercial kite and then continues on to analyse what is the difference between her product and the one that works. The fourth point I wish to make in terms of looking at the classroom as a productive assessment system is the need for teachers to balance both formative and summative assessment. I think there's a tendency to think that summative assessment only happens at the end of a period of learning, but teachers can sum up during the learning and use what they know to help the students come together to solve problems together, so it's not an individual act, and they can also accumulate information over the course of the teaching sequence. So here we just have two examples where on the right where the teacher has recorded some ideas, and on the left where there's a developing classroom wall display of the things that are of interest.
5 minutes left.
Thank you. The last point that I want to make in relation to this is that the curriculum document that our teachers are working from accords value to the contribution that families can make to children's learning. There can be a tendency to just report to parents on students' progress at fixed times during the year and through written reports. Because our classes include a number of English second language speakers, this is often not the best way to communicate with parents. So our teachers have found that they can engage their families in the learning and assessment process by inviting them in at the beginning of a unit to tell them what's going to happen, and using class websites and wall displays to keep families up to date with what's going on. So on the left we have a performance where the students made masks. In the middle we have a student telling the parents who've come along to afternoon tea what this class is going to be studying, and on the right we have that class and their parents coming together to talk through and look at what the children have learned. So just to conclude, classroom teachers are responsible for a variety of assessment purposes: formative, summative and accountability. Our challenge as researchers and educators is to help them manage these challenges, which are often contradictory, in a way that keeps the focus on students and their learning. I think we realise that it's difficult for teachers to change their practice in isolation. We need to look up all levels of the system for leadership and support and resourcing. And I think from my experience, there's real value in bringing teachers together to plan for learning and to look at student work and talk with each other about what can my students do and achieve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kui. Now, we have some questions. Let me start with a question that is being raised by one of the participants. It says, competition among schools is not existed as mentioned in the first session in Finland as a tool of improving the quality of work. And as it is said, it is not that obvious between government schools and private schools. In New Zealand, does competition amongst schools is existed? Does it exist? And what is the effect of it?
A very good question.
Excuse me?
My personal response, I think some level of competition always exists in the sense of comparison, and we do have both state-funded and private schools. But on the whole, I think our system is very collaborative in that teachers are prepared to come together and share the things they've learned and the things they do. And so I think that to me would be a strength of our system. We are in some discussion as a nation at the moment about the role of national standards at the primary level and how that will impact on an environment that might become competitive. So I think Collaboration would be the dominant feature.
Okay. Also, there is another question that it has been understood during the session that the teacher puts him or her curriculum. Now, what is the indicator of formative justice or information justice among the students?
So, can I just clarify? So, in New Zealand, there is a national curriculum that provides a broad framework of learning outcomes, and within that curriculum, especially at the primary level, schools and teachers are obliged to devise a curriculum that builds on student and community strengths and interests. I don't think I've answered the second part of the question. Could you say that again, please?
Excuse me? Say the other question.
The second part of the question.
See, the question again? The second part of the question, yeah. It concentrates on formative justice, or information justice between students. How is it guaranteed? How is it controlled?
You mean formative assessment is usually grounded in the classroom. The comparison between schools can happen through the national standards. We also have an education review office that does audit schools in a way that also contributes to their self-improvement.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Koyi, for this beneficial presentation. Shukran jazeeran.
Thank you for Dr. Koyi, the head of the Institute of Education Research, for this presentation. Now we move to the second speaker, His Excellency Dr. Zuhair Salah. He is going to present a paper about proposed criteria for education. Before we start, please, you can put the mobile phone number on the screen so the audience can send their messages or SMS to that number for questions and comments. Dr. Abdul Juhani, he is the Director General of Studies and Development at the National Authority of Assessment and Accreditation. He has a PhD in Mechanical Engineering from Colorado University, and he has a master's degree in Mechanical Engineering from the same university, and he has a bachelor degree of Bachelor Engineering or Mechanical Engineering from Riyadh University or King Saud University now. He is an associate professor at King Saud University, and he is on secondment of the National Authority of Assessment and Academic Accreditation. He is the director or the assistant director of Development and Studies on the National Body of Assessment, and he is the head of managing the certificates at the Ministry of Higher Education. Welcome, Mr. Abdul Jabbar. We will have 20 minutes for the presentation, and after that we will have a discussion after the presentation. Good morning. In fact, this presentation, I wanted to quote quality assurance in higher education, some of the good practices that might be useful to adopt in public or general education sector. This is an attempt, a humble attempt to come up with some of the recommendations or criteria that could be adopted in general education sector, but it starts from the higher education, in higher education. And in most of them, these are good practices, and they are not criteria. The first criteria is to have an advanced or a prior planning and the assessment criteria for each curriculum. From this starting point, we ask the educational institutions to describe their curricula. So from the start, the design of the curricula, the curriculum, so the outcomes of learning would be described clearly, and the strategies of teaching and assessment would be clarified for each outcome, educational outcome. This might seem or appear as a prerequisite, or but might be something taken for granted, but there were discrepancies in adopting this criteria. To some extent, we were forced to design a template for the description of curriculum to ensure that the curriculum will be described on the basis that I have just described. The other part is the necessity of aligning the assessment mechanisms and the outcomes themselves. If the outcome require a certain assessment, we must stick in assessment the mechanisms that are suitable for that outcome. One example, if the objective or one of the outcomes is the communication in a certain manner or rhetoric, so the mechanisms of assessment must be consistent with the nature of this requirement. This issue for a long time was the theme of a lot of research, and in many cases the institutions reconsider the assessment methods in order to ensure the consistency of the assessment mechanisms of the educational outcomes that are being measured or assessed. It is very important that the students must be familiar or must have prior knowledge of the where they are, their performance is measured and assessed, and this part might be better defined. The assessment is subject to percentages that are determined by the authority responsible for the educational institution. So there is no, the teacher has no autonomy in this respect. And we have heard from the first speaker about the possibility that the teacher by himself can balance the assessment and the summative and formative assessment, and this might look something new for me. What takes place in higher education in our educational institutions, these are planned in advance through the regulations and rules. So getting out of this, so we could task the teacher to balance between the assessment of the summative and formative assessment. I think this is this is a pioneering idea, and we must consider it. The problem that takes place in our educational institutions as a result of isolation of each institution, we cannot make sure that the achievement levels are consistent on the sector as a whole. So we see that in a certain school or in a certain educational institution, you might find some criteria of measurement or achievement might vary from the other institutions. In higher education institutions in some countries, particularly in Britain and some European countries, there is a good practice that the experiences might be shared among the educational institutions through the external examiner. So the institution hosts an expert in the area of the specialty, so he works for a short time inside the institution, and he will write a report to the authorities at the school, and the goal of that is, or the objective of that is, sharing or transfer of experience between the educational institutions. So in the end, we could have consistency regarding the expected educational achievement that could be reflected through the evaluation system. The coverage of the assessment for all the curriculum, this is something else, and it is well known that we use a matrix of the test, so to cover the curricula. I mentioned this because in higher education we ask the educational institutions to have a matrix for each curricula, so we could put the exams that the exam cover all the expected outcomes of the curricula. The training processes for new teachers, this is very important, and I think that we must not that the qualification must not stop at the level of the beginner or the new teachers, but we must have continuous or lifelong learning and development of the skills, of teaching skills for the people responsible for teaching, and this could be forced through the regulations or rules for the promotion, or could be linked closely with the licenses that are being granted to the teachers at different levels. There are, in many cases, there are abnormal results that tend to exaggerate and inflating the results of the achievement, or there is an exaggeration on the other side. In both cases, these things we must put mechanisms to deal with them. One of the things that we ask the educational institution to participate in assessment a lot of people instead of being tasked to one person. So always a number of ideas is better than one person giving an assessment. So in this case, we can task the assessment tools for a number of people, and then the assessment to more than one person, and this will lead to balancing between the difficulty and being strict or in the levels of assessment and evaluation. And integrity is another requirement in our all work. We must make sure, and I am talking about the integrity of the honesty of the students. Now it is available for the students to go to the internet, and they can find a published research, and they can quote from that research, and they can compromise the integrity and the research. Some institutions are very keen to use even some software or some software packages that might discover the quotation of the material quoted from the internet, this part, or plagiarism. I think he's talking about plagiarism. So any person, whether he is a student at the higher education or general education, they can quote of the works that is published on the internet, and the quotation might not be harmful if the student was keen to reference the outcomes of the quotation to the main source of the information. But the fear is, and some students might